the ridiculous thing that no one's talking about is that we're looking at energy efficiency as a EUI, as basically per square foot. But if we keep building more square feet, if we double the amount of square feet that we're building every, I don't know, 15 years or whatever, if we double the amount of square feet in the world in 15 years, I don't know if that's the case, but let's say we did, but we only made it a quarter, and each one used 3/4 as much energy. So we shaved off a quarter of the energy. You could see how we're still behind. Like, we're still producing more in absolute numbers. We're still producing way more carbon. And so architects get very uncomfortable talking about like the idea of not building, because that seems like, understandably, that's like, why would you go into
Right.
architecture to not build? So
Right.
there's that kind of embarrassing, like, let's not talk about it. Let's not talk about it. And also, when I first started teaching, if you put, in terms of sources of electricity, if you put coal in one hand and you put everything else in the other one, you put natural gas and oil and solar and wind and hydro and nuclear all in the other one. Uh, the first hand had more, was most, it was bigger than the others combined. There was more in the US. There was more electricity generation with coal than everything else combined. Now coal's like, I don't know, maybe 25% or something like that.
Yeah.
And renewables are, I don't know, they might be creeping up to something like 30%. And you're like, oh my gosh, that's amazing. Like, at this rate, we'll be fine. But 30%, but we're using more total power, right? So
So, what happens when an architect redesigns how we learn? Today's guest, Michael Ermann, professor at Virginia Tech and founder of Amber Book and Olive Book, has helped over 30,000 architects pass their exams through stunning visual learning and design-led education. In this episode, Michael breaks down how to turn complex systems, things like sound, airflow, circuits, into stories your brain will actually remember, the surprising truth about glass and efficiency in buildings, and how AI and animation are rewriting what the classroom looks like. If you care about smarter buildings and smarter learning, this one's for you. Let's get into it. Hey everyone, thanks for listening to another episode of Buildings 2.0. Today I have a really cool guest, Michael Ermann, architecture professor at Virginia Tech, founder of Amber Book, and founder of Olive Book. He's on a mission to make and transform SAT preparation better, more engaging by using visual learning and designing by some of the principles in design itself. And he's also launched Amber Book, a university level course that's making it easier for folks like myself to pass the AREs. So I'm excited to geek out with you about that. But before diving in, take us back. Why buildings? Like, what we have time. What's the story?
yeah, it's probably a story that's going to sound familiar to a lot of your audience. It was kind of Lincoln Logs to Legos. My undergraduate was in math at Tulane, and then I went to University of Florida for both architecture and architectural acoustics. Became an architectural acoustician in New York City, and then fairly quickly started applying for faculty jobs. I always had an interest in teaching. Both my parents are teachers. Everyone in my family is a teacher, or works at a university, or both. And so it felt like a kind of a family business, or a little bit of a natural fit for me. And then beginning in maybe 2010, I started teaching 3-day boot camps for folks who were taking the architecture licensure exams for AIA chapters around the country, including AIA in New York. I did, I think, 12 there. And people would say, will you do that online? Can you, make a version of that? And I can't think of anything that would be more boring than a tripod of me talking about architecture but I was interested in it as an idea. If I could, I didn't really ever think, and I still don't think I can make it as good as it is in person, but my goal was to, like, can I come close to what it is in person? And that's about the time I discovered animation and just how fertile animation is for showing things that vary across the time domains. It could be sound moving across the room. It could be air moving through a duct. It could be electrons moving around a circuit, plumbing, you name it. How we build buildings with masonry, whatever it is, like things that vary over time really lend themselves to animation. I created Amber Book, the online course, which now it's well over 30,000 enrolled over the last 10 years or so.
So you clearly skipped through a lot there from zero to.
Sure, I can.
Yeah, we have time, but I mean, you dropped a few nuggets there that I'm really interested in learning more. I think what was you mentioned the importance of visual learning as opposed to what maybe that in person.
I think that one of the things I hear all the time from architects is, well, we're architects, we're visual learners. What
Yeah.
I've come to understand is that everybody as a visual learner. No one ever looked, even someone who's not an architect ever looked at a graph and said, can you put that back into a table format? I want to see rows and columns of numbers so I can get a better handle on it. And so I've kind of come around to the idea that maybe we're not so special. I try not to tell people that. They're like, oh, we're architects, so we're visual learners. I'm like, yeah, I think everyone is now. But I can kind of unpack some of that. So as an undergraduate, well, I was always teaching. I was tutoring little kids, sometimes as a volunteer, sometimes for pay with SAT prep or just kind of general math prep or just general school prep. I've always volunteered in the schools over all these years. And so I was always kind of around little kids and helping them out. So it was always kind of one may say that, elementary school is very different than teaching college, and it's probably true. But those of you guys who went to architecture school know that elementary school is actually a lot like architecture school. I'm about to go to studio in a few hours. The students will have, been cutting and pasting and coloring and they have the same small class that they have all day and they have all year. And they know their teachers really well. And, so I think there's kind of in the best possible way, an overlap in the Venn diagram between elementary school and architecture at the university level. I was interested in combining both physics because I had an interest in physics and architecture. I didn't know that there was such a thing as architectural acoustics. In fact, I called it acoustical architecture. And I just started kind of telling people that's what I wanted to do. And this is before the days of the internet. And so I don't know how we found out things like that, but I guess my father's cousin worked with an architect on a warehouse, and that architect had done a concert hall. So the concert hall had an acoustical consultant. And so I went up to New York and I asked that acoustical consultant, I said, what should I do if I want to do what you do? And he was like, go to University of Florida, which I know, Jose, you went to as well a few years after me. And I said, all right. I mean, I have spent more time looking at a fast food menu, trying to decide what to order for a single meal than I spent deciding where to go to graduate school and what, kind of what to study. It was it's kind of looking back on it. And if I had to be honest, if I had known there was such a thing as architectural lighting, because again, my undergraduate degree was not in architecture, so I didn't have a background in that.
Right.
So if I had known there was such a thing as architectural lighting or kind of, envelope building science, I probably would have done one of those two. I'm not a musician, and most of the great acousticians have some background in architecture, some background in math or physics or engineering, and some background in music. Most of the great ones. Most of us, though, just have two of the three. Because I have two of the three, and I'm not a musician, I sometimes wonder if maybe, if I had known, I would have gone in another direction. But I really, really enjoyed, I still do enjoy architectural acoustics. I wrote a book called Architectural Acoustics Illustrated, which is kind of like a Ching book, but for architectural acoustics. It's just what it sounds like. And so you're starting to see themes in what seem like a disparate set of interests and kind of education and a visual, kind of a visual first form of education. And so, I wrote a book and I was an acoustical consultant, did, everything from theaters and concert halls to noise ordinances to mechanical noise, footfall noise for multifamily, and everything in between. And that was very much for me the ticket into academia at a young age. I think, kind of now that I've been here for a while as a professor, I see the importance of being unimportant. Kind of both in the academy and in the field. I think there's probably a little bit of a valorization of the noble generalist. This kind of idea that there's the highest calling of an architect is to be a little bit of everything. And and at the time anyway, I was a lot of a little thing. So I was an architectural acoustician, and that really helped me get the job as faculty, because I think a lot of architects feel like, and even architecture faculty feel like acoustics is kind of a black box. It's maybe kind of magic
Yeah.
and sorcery. I'm here to tell you it's not at all. It's actually, architects are very capable of handling 75% of acoustical issues without without expertise. Probably I could sit down with most architects and in a half a day we could knock out 75% of acoustical defects, just kind of from the beginning.
That's super interesting. To zoom out for a moment, because I want to
Mhm.
ask, you just casually dropped that, in your experience in academia, you've also built a product that now has serviced 30,000 people. I'm curious, you're on the front lines of, again, a renowned architectural program where you're teaching classes, but you've also built a service to service people online. The very nature of teaching, I think, is evolving today than it was maybe even 15, 30 years ago, where like the sheer amount of people you have been able to service, I think, with Amber Book and all of is insane.
It's
What
remarkable.
what's the future of teaching if you are able to your point, put a phone and record yourself and teach, and you can potentially reach thousands of people versus the kind of the value of in person. And of course, very unlikely you're going to be able to reach 30,000 people, very
In
easily.
person.
What are the implications there in terms of like just the future of teaching in general? Not
Man, Jose, I don't know. No, I mean, this is a really big question, and I think there's probably three answers to it. One is I don't think that the in-person model is going anywhere. But then again, I'm the guy who in the 90s was like, the internet's not going to change anything. Like anyone who wasn't, a techno optimist, I was like, what are you talking about? It's just going to make it easier for us to order from catalogs. So I don't have the best track record when it comes to predicting the future and especially the future of technology. But I don't think, we have evolutionary biology evolved us to interact, and so I just don't think that in person, especially in the sense of like studio teaching, I don't think that's going anywhere.
right.
Um, uh, that's not true. I think it may go somewhere, but I don't think it'll be of a comparable quality. I think the highest quality teaching is still going to be done online. I mean, and I sold Amber Book because I wanted to. It was getting too big to do both Amber Book and to teach, and I in person. While Amber Book, like you said, it reaches way more people than the 15 in my current studio. I still valued the studio interaction enough that I prefer that I sold the online course so I could continue to teach. So that's one answer. A second answer is, yeah, it's incredible. I mean, to be able to disseminate a course online, but it goes well beyond that to be able to animate because we have our course is animated. Both courses are animated. We've spent well over $1 million on animation. We take that stuff really seriously, and we'll do anything it takes for as long as it takes. Excuse me to if there's instructional value on spending a lot of money and doing it better, that's kind of our creed is like, well, we'll just figure out a way to do that. And our animations are not Pixar kind of level things. They're pretty chunky. Our hero is the man in the wheelchair on the handicap sign. That's kind of like, like a clear diagram. A clear chunky diagram is a very inexpensive way to animate. And I built my own animation studio, and we could talk about that a bit too. But so it's not just the idea of the internet as a vehicle for getting the course out there. It's the animation. It's the being able to find remote animators because in my small town of 20,000 full-time residents, it's not likely I would found one. It's the ability to charge people's credit cards online. I won't say it's any marketing because we've never done any of that when I owned the company really, but so that's the second answer is that it is incredible. It is one hell of a lever to be able to do that. Now I have a third answer, and that's kind of, as you might imagine, probably like everyone on your podcast the last 6 months is kind of the AI answer. And I'm not quite sure where that's going, but I will say that my opinion of AI as a teaching tool, I've been dabbling with it like the rest of us since late 2022. And like many of the rest of us, I thought it was really promising and cool, but not quite there yet. Until this semester, I have become a convert. And the reason I've become a convert is because I want to learn Spanish. And so I'm taking a Spanish course at the university, and I'm a podcast freak like you probably are too, and some of the people listening are. And I just started asking ChatGPT to kind of, I'd take a photo. I take photos of my vocabulary and conjugation and that kind of thing. And I say, okay, give me English sentences. And I cannot believe I cannot believe how valuable it is. I mean, I walk to work and, of course I do dishes and mow the lawn and all the stuff that people do. And I always have my headphones on when I'm doing it, but now I'm talking to my headphones and they're talking back to me. And I have an interest in Valencia, Spain. So I asked ChatGPT to switch to a Valencian accent, and she did. And 2 months ago, I never put two words together in Spanish in my life. And now I'm having, this morning I met with Maria, a former student, and she's studying for the AREs, and I'm teaching her the AREs in Spanish to the best of my ability. And she's teaching,
Wow.
and she's, so we're talking, I mean, it's still 3/4 English, but we're talking in Spanish and English to one
Right.
another. And so I'm learning Spanish in exchange for her, her studying for the AREs. And I'm not a language person. So I would not have been I would not have been a candidate 2 months into studying Spanish with one 3 credit course. I would not have been a candidate to have conversations with people before AI. So I am now completely sold on
Right.
at least the potential of AI as a teaching
I,
tool.
I've got so many questions on that because perhaps this is a question you're often bombarded with as a professor, but I guess maybe on the podcast itself we get to spend a little less time. So the role of AI in education, I assume there's going to be the folks, as you've said, that embrace it, and other folks that perhaps you know kind of are against it, and I'm sure there's going to be
Mm,
some sort of place in the middle here. But how I have a 14-month-old daughter, and
mhm.
one of the things that keeps me up at night is that like I've just literally got no idea like what schooling will even look like in 10
Yeah.
years because I myself have been just floored by how it's trickled into how AI has trickled into almost every aspect of my life, from kind of personal planning to business outlines, presentations, translations, even perhaps something that has become kind of dear to me, my father-in-law kind of developing Alzheimer's, and just being able to sit down with him and kind of chat with AI to recall the Yankees players of the 1950s and stats. And
Mm.
it's just been really fascinating to hear, his perspective with AI as someone who's kind of seeing his kind of memory go. And the long way of saying, I too have been long converted. And so, what does that mean though for the classroom? I guess we're all wondering this, but what do you think?
Yeah. So a few things. When your daughter, in 10 years, your daughter will be 10. And when I was 10, if you actually mapped out my day at school, it wasn't really that much of it was learning information, right? It was, if you kind of add up lunch and recess and PE and art and library and whatever, I'm kind of going through some of the, I took an architecture course in high school. You kind of start to add, well, I guess we're talking about 10-year olds. So yeah, you kind of add those all up. That's probably half the day right there. And then you add in learning to get along with others, learning to work in teams, learning to be curious. And so that's maybe another quarter. So actually just kind of learning the facts while it's very important. It's a huge part of school. It is not necessarily, I don't really buy that it's the main thing we do in school, especially at that age.
Mm,
And there have always been libraries with all the information. And for the last 20 years, there's been Google. It's organized all that information, at our fingertips and in our pockets, beginning in 2010ish. So um, I don't know that AI is going to be as transformative to education as the techno optimists, are claiming. It will be transformative to looking stuff up. And I now see, and for me, it's absolutely transformative for kind of going beyond the homework. So there's homework that I have to do, and I get a lot out of it in Spanish. But then there's talking to her, and it's like I just can't believe how useful it is for that one use case relative to other things. Beginning in
right.
20, beginning in the first full semester of ChatGPT, I changed all my exams in my building systems class to be open note, open book, open internet, and open AI. Not the company open AI, but just open to AI. And so students can use AI in my tests, or at least they could then. I'm not sure if I would do that exactly the same now because AI is so much more powerful now. But and this summer I wrote to all my students in my studio and I said, here's 2 tutorials I've been using for Midjourney, and here's my experience so far. I encourage you guys to do it too. I've kind of been almost bullying them to use AI in design, but really they haven't. They're resistant, and I'm okay with that. I'm not an evangelist, and I'm not that prescriptive that I think it's that important. But I do suspect that everyone who comes after them is going to be using it, and they'll be the last. These are fourth year
Mm,
undergraduates. These will be the last people who are not using it and who think of it as
mm,
somehow dirty.
mm,
And I, as it does, as kind of learning Spanish as design, as kind of someone generating a bunch of designs, as a kind of an educational tool, I'm pretty excited about it. I was amused. I'm happy to see that this has kind of waned a bit. I was amused in the early days that the overwhelming discussion surrounding AI in education was about cheating. I just think it's such a rounding error. Like, okay, yeah, there's cheating, but like, oh my gosh, like that's on us. Like it's on us as faculty to kind of, as teachers, to say, okay, like how do we, okay, maybe there aren't take home tests, or maybe there are, and there's AI is available, but now you're asking PhD level questions to 15-year-olds and then interviewing them afterward about kind of making sure they actually understand it, that what they wrote down. But I for one cannot wait. I really can't wait. I mean, I see the dangers. I think it's, I agree with the people who are skeptical about AI taking over. I think that's unlikely, but I think the penalty is so high that even if it's unlikely, it's very serious to kind of consider. Obviously, it'll be wildly disruptive to the workforce. 100 years ago, 90% of us were in agriculture. If you had told someone then that in 100 years, it's going to be 1% in the US, it's in agriculture, they'd say, what are the other 89% of people going to do with their days? And somehow we've figured out a way. So in the medium term, I'm actually fairly optimistic that the workforce issues are going to work themselves out. And I think that anyone who's critical of AI needs to be nuanced about that and say, okay, I think AI may take over and launch nukes. That's legitimate. But the chances of AI saving a loved one from Alzheimer's, for instance, is not zero. Like there's actually a pretty good chance that AI may save a bunch of us from Alzheimer's. So I think there needs, and I think this whole discussion is going to sound ridiculous in a few years. Like if someone listens to this podcast in a few years, they're going to laugh because like they're talking about AI, like it's a thing, but everything will be AI then, the way that, people 20 years ago talked about the World Wide Web. And they, or globalism, and those all seem like really interesting things. And now if you hear, it's really cringy to hear someone talk about the World Wide Web or globalism, because it's like, well, those already happened. And so, that's just our lives now. So,
Yeah. In that spirit, similarly, there's been different conversations in architecture school proper whereby, we were concerning ourselves with, the purity of structure and modernism and culture with postmodernism. And at some point in the 90s, we got weird with kind of blobism and then later parametricism. What are students concerning themselves or asking themselves with today?
It's a really good question. It's really hard to know it when you're in it, Jose. Like it's like when you're in the middle of it, I mean, I think a lot of us look back on that stuff in the early 80s and say, how did they not know? Like, how did they not know how it's like that what they thought of as whimsy would be looked at as silly later on, the shapy postmodern stuff. And certainly I have my own biases and you can go to a city you've never been to and walk in the architecture school, even if all the students on a given floor are doing the same project at the same time, and even if there's no walls between studios, you can see where one studio ends and the next one begins as clear as day, right? And so there's a lot more variety within a school than I think than we maybe talk about. I can speak to me and my students. We build physical models all the time. That won't surprise you because you came from the same academic DNA as I did. At University of Florida, the whole crit was talking about the models. No one even looked at the wall, at the drawings. Like it wasn't even done. It was all the model, and the model was the way you worked out your building as well. The model sketch was the way you worked out your building. And so that's where I came from. That's probably my highest use. That's my highest use as a teacher, is kind of bringing the kind of model sketch, the cardboard or chipboard model sketch, into every discussion. If a student comes to me and says they had a bad breakup, I say build a model. If they say they had, they stubbed their toe, I say build a model. Like whatever is the problem that a student is having, I am a kind of a technique determinist, I guess would be the right phrase for it. Where, if you can see a project, real built project, and right away whether they started with model or started with drawing. It's like as clear as day. And so if you looked at my student work right now, it would be, I think if you looked at that work now, and I think if you looked at that work 15 or 20 years ago, I think it would be, I think the process would be remarkably similar. The renderings would be way better, but because I teach a lot of the technology courses, I think the competence in technology would be higher than most. And also, I'm teaching a particular studio that kind of values that right now. But other than that, I don't know that it would be that different. I don't know that it would be that different than you would have seen a while ago. But in looking across the profession, I think some of the same problems endure. Kind of ignoring the space between the road and the building, I think is a big problem in the academy. Probably a bigger problem in the profession, in practice. I think that's still probably there. I think even someone like me who, was lead accredited professional, and the first year lead was out, and in 2001, and since 2001, and teaches building systems and sustainability and efficiency. But I think if you looked at my studio students, you might be a little bit disappointed that I haven't done a better job of kind of demanding a high performance and low energy in some of their work. So I think you'd see that. I think you'd see more screens than probably that would be a constant. I think architects are still way too obsessed with the wall, at the expense of the roof or of the interior overhead plane. I'm in a personal crusade to bring back or maybe it was never there, to bring up the reflected ceiling plan as the highest form of architecture. I think it's by far the most important drawing. I don't know why it's maligned and passed off to new people, and kind of, I mean, that's why the ceilings look so bad. And I can't think of anything more important than the overhead plane as a translator of the quality of a space. And especially now that we can't do much with the underfoot plane because of ADA and universal design, it's really, the walls aren't that. The walls as an elevation are really important, but the walls as a plan, we don't experience space and plan.
Where did we go wrong with the reflected ceiling plan? Like how did we go wrong?
Okay, so that is a good question. So you tell me, because you have a background in managing construction projects, but drywallers are like remarkably cheap. I cannot believe how cheap drywallers are. And so the idea that we have to have a ceiling grid because, God forbid, at sometime in the future, we're going to have to, address a leaky pipe, and it'll be easier to do with a ceiling grid. That's true. It's way easier with a ceiling grid than with a drywaller, but it's not that hard with a drywaller. And so I think and maybe there's a kind of a belief that you can't have good acoustics without an absorbent ceiling, which is not true at all. You need an area. Often, if for unamplified speech, you need an area equal to about the floor area, but it doesn't all have to be on the ceiling. And there's certainly a lot of good reasons why the middle of the ceiling ought to be sound reflective in most of those instances. And then, the upper portions of the walls maybe also should be absorptive. So, and there's lots of ways to absorb sound that don't involve a grid. So, I would say that would probably be a big part of it. I don't know. I don't know, but I just don't. Maybe you have some ideas.
I only ask because I am often staring at reflected ceiling plans in addition to floor plans as a result of the work we do with scanning and modeling buildings. I will say that they often do feel as an afterthought as opposed to like an intentional design project, to your point. And so that's a just curious point that I hadn't really.
No, it's really quite painful to look at Divasari or ArcDaily or DZine and see no ceiling grids and no parking lots, and then go into any building that's of a certain size and see basically ceiling grids and parking lots as far as the eye can see. And, I just don't know what to make of it. But so anyhow, but to your question about what the students are doing now, I think there's a lot of screens. I do think in terms of what's going to not age well, all these really thin horizontal wood strips that are on buildings as a screen are really beautiful on the first day. And they probably remain beautiful in New Mexico. But if you're in a climate that's wet or even moderately wet, I keep looking for, I'll see a project from 5 or 7 years ago that has one of these kind of thin wood screens, horizontal screens. And all the little thin elements are parallel. Nothing's warped, nothing's split, nothing's kind of gotten brown, or, it's all kind of really shiny wood. And then I'll start searching for photos of it now. And I don't know how to find them. Maybe ChatGPT can help me, but I don't know how to find the photos now. But I would love to see a book someone comes out I don't think they'd have to show it 10 years later. I think 5 years later, to see those screens with the really thin wood in wet climates, I got to think that they're not going to be parallel anymore, and that those buildings are going to be a pretty bad look. It's the same thing with Portland Place concrete. I mean, it's really beautiful when Rick Joy does it in the desert, but when someone does it in the East Coast of the U.S., I mean, all you have to do is walk around any place with, exposed concrete buildings. They look nasty, really, really, unless they're on a regime of, kind of regular power washing. They look nasty pretty quick. And I think we ought to be having some of those photos as well, kind of shared with the world.
What on that, in your building systems class, like, what are you telling your kids, your students? Like, what do you, like, what, give me the kind of the 3 must knows that you kind of tell your students, like, hey, like, look out for the stuff. You already began to allude to it.
So in no particular order, you need to be at a level where you're not going to be bullied by your engineers, because it's your building and they probably don't care about it as much as you do, although some will. And, you don't have to accept that rooftop equipment needs to be visible, or that a roof needs to be penetrated 6 times for plumbing vents or something like that. So, kind of just enough, because I think a lot of architects are intimidated by the engineers. And so they just kind of like, well, the engineer said it has to be that way. So I would say that's the first thing. The flip side of that is that you have to let the engineer do their job. I mean, they're not asking for more room for ductwork, and ductwork is by far the most relevant for architects because it's just so much bigger. Ductwork and HVAC equipment, it's just physically so much, it's at the scale of the architecture. Whereas, wiring, even in conduit, is, you know, a rounding error at the scale that architects typically work at, and can be worked around. You could pretty easily go under the structure, around it, or something, or through the structure with a conduit in a
Right.
way that you just can't do with ducks. So by the same token, kind of giving them enough room to do specifically the HVAC stuff that they need to do, so that you can have a comfortable environment and that kind of thing. And a quiet one, because if you don't give them enough room, the ducts are going to be really small, and then the air is going to have to move through them very fast, and it's going to be very loud and so forth. And then the students, I teach the students all the stuff that we all learned, but there are three things that we learned that were kind of wrong. That now we know, or maybe we knew then, but I didn't know, and most of the building scientists I knew kind of didn't talk about. One is, we kind of were told that it really matters where you orient your building. Like, if you can just bring in the heat from south facing glass in the winter, and we can turn our backs to north facing wind in the winter, and but it's no. The wind comes from all kinds of directions typically in the winter, and B, people just use air conditioning a lot now. They don't. So the kind of idea of like capturing breezes, or something like that. And it turns out it really doesn't, unless you have a really small building, like a house, in a really dry, sunny, cool climate like Montana. In that case, orientation, when I put stuff into whatever building model, whatever energy model, it
Right.
seems to matter there. But if I put a building of any size, a building of almost any size, even in a cold climate, at least in its core, needs air conditioning almost year round. And so the idea of capturing the heat in the winter is kind of a weird idea. And then the sealed shut, and architects aren't doing that many houses, and
Mm.
so once you kind of, and then when there's one software I used to use called Sapphira. You could rotate the building around like in real time, and it didn't change the energy use that much.
Mm.
So that's the first thing that we kind of taught people that I think we probably went wrong. The second thing is, now that the codes require pretty good insulation, the next lowest hanging fruit is definitely airtightness. And our our loosest buildings are like 20 times leakier than our tight ones.
Wow.
It's not like a 10% difference or a 20% difference. It's like a 20x or 10x difference
Wow.
between, two new buildings. One could easily be 10 times tighter than the other. So just kind of detailing for air tightness is a much bigger deal than I learned
Yeah.
when I was coming through. And finally, and this one pains me. It pains me. It's going to make your listeners turn it off, turn off the podcast. But it is impossible in any building that I know of to have a low energy, high performing building with a window to wall ratio greater than zero point 0.3. Like, in other words, if more than 30% of your wall is window, as much as I love, kind of the perch like feeling of having floor to ceiling glass, there's nothing you can do to have a better than average kind of building from an
Right.
energy point of view if you do that. So I took three things and kind of combined them into one, and then the other
Yeah.
two, of course, are about interfacing with the engineer.
So if I understood that correctly, it's like we need less glass. We may have over optimized on daylight, like best practices of orientation, if I heard that
Hmm.
correctly. Because again,
Hmm.
we're unsealing our
Hmm.
buildings, and don't be afraid to push back a little bit on the engineer.
I think those are all true. I will say, I'll walk the orientation thing back a little.
Yeah.
Shading is really important, and that does have to do with building orientation. So if you can kind of shade the windows, that is a really big deal. And
Mm,
and building orientation, that matters. But in terms of like capturing heat,
right, right.
in terms of kind of capturing heat for the winter, I think that was oversold in most of our education.
Mm, mm. Now, I mean, you alluded to this in 2001, like the year, Lead came out, like you were licensed. From then to, I guess, what, 24 years later, the sustainability in and of itself is now become kind of a catch-all for a bunch of stuff, from just like a whole product industry to design practices. Now having the benefit of over 2 decades here, how do you define sustainability today in a way that's non-cliche? Like, what does it mean to be?
And energy use, the operational energy use of the building. But with, again, two caveats. The first is, like, I remember we have a solar decathlon, which is the thing where the students design the houses that are on the National Mall and compete. And the solar decathlon team asked me if I would help them with their sustainability because they had to come up with some kind of a report. So this was
Mm.
2008-ish. And so I said, okay. And they're like, we have to come up with a report on sustainability. I said, okay. And they said, we're using this thing called EcoTile. Can you write about it? And I was like, what? I don't even know what EcoTile is. So I look up EcoTile and I can't figure out what's eco about EcoTile. So I call them up and the woman's like, hello. And I'm just like, yeah, can you tell me what's eco about your EcoTile? And swear to God, she's like, it's eco. And I'm like, yeah, but what makes it kind of, what is it about it? And she's like, hold on. And she left for quite a while and she came back and she said, our EcoTile is non-toxic. And I said, are your other tiles toxic? And she said, I don't know. And I said, can you check? And she left for a while again and she came back and she said, no, none of our tiles are toxic. And I said, well, then what makes your EcoTile? And so help me. She said, well, it's non-toxic. And so it's like this kind of circular logic. And everyone in the AEC industry knows 100 stories just like that, especially from the greenwashing era of 10 or 15 years ago. But it's a little disingenuous for two reasons. One is almost all those stories involve materials that claim to be sustainable. Energy bills are energy bills, and so if you kind of look at the energy bill for a building, that tells you just about everything you need to know about its sustainability, because most of the smart people, until fairly recently, most of the smart people who are good at this stuff were telling us that 90 or even 95% of the environmental impact of a building was in its operation. So in its HVAC, its lighting, and so forth. And only 5 or 10% were in the actual construction, which meant if you were going to shave 10% off the total environmental footprint of a building, it was way easier to do it with, kind of efficient operations, shading the window, efficient HVAC system, whatever. It was way easier to do, way more doable to do that. You couldn't take 10% off. You couldn't have a building if you took 10% off the whole building's footprint if the entire building construction was 5 or 10%. And so for years, I mean, for almost all of my career, I had been beating the drum of, like, don't worry about the materials. I mean, don't use resins, and concrete's awful from a sustainability point of view. But short of those two things, if you have X hours in your design to focus on something sustainable, you're way better off focusing on efficient systems or shading or air tightness and so forth than you are, worrying about. And everyone always, again, fixates on the wall, what the exterior element of the wall is, as if that's like a major part of the building with, by weight or area or anything. The caveat, though, is that a lot of the smart people I'm talking to and reading now are telling me just the opposite. And it's not inconsistent. It's not an inconsistency, because basically the assumption is we are continuing to ramp up renewables and carbon-free sources of electricity, and we're making our buildings all electric. It used to be, when you thought about the operations of a building, you said, okay, the building's going to be in use for 75 years. It's going to be using this much electricity. Electricity is right now 52% coal in my area, and therefore it will have this environmental impact. Well, that changes if over the next 10 years, it's going to be basically 90% renewable, right? All of a sudden then, because it kind of has to be, like, we have to fix that, right? The alternative is, who cares? Like, it's all over anyway. And so if at the utility scale, if we're going to have all electric buildings and they're going to be, eventually almost all renewable in terms of their power, suddenly the operations, the lighting, the HVAC really isn't that big a deal. And the materials, because that's making those materials for the building is putting carbon in the air now that is going to be there, for 100 years. Whereas, so a lot of the smart people are saying exactly the opposite, that maybe materials are the place. And so I'm just now catching up to that. And I have to say, I'm pretty far behind. I believe them because they seem like they're smart people, Um, but I just don't understand exactly. But if I was going to focus on materials, again, I would be focused on really two things. I would be focused on VOC as it relates to indoor air quality, and I'd be focused on embodied energy. But the
Yeah.
embodied energy is a trick too. If you, I mean, at least until recently, and it's probably still the case, if you Google embodied energy of building materials, in the first one you see, I forgot what the order is, but I think in the first one you see concrete has the lowest environmental degradation. It has concrete's the best, comes out the best. And in the second one you see in Google, if you click on images and you look at the graphs, concrete is the worst. And a lot of that is because it's whether it's by weight or square foot. The concrete's so heavy that if you look at it per unit of weight, it winds up somehow looking good, even though it's, if concrete were a country, it would be the third biggest polluter, third largest source of CO2 in the planet after the U.S. and China. It's 5% of all greenhouse gases, all greenhouse warming is from concrete, and so the concrete's really wicked. But if you look at it on a per weight basis and you compare it to like aluminum, which also has a lot of embodied energy in it, then suddenly it looks not so bad. So anyhow, I don't know. It's a mess. It's above my pay grade. I haven't really gotten into it as much as I probably should.
Yeah, I'm curious on that argument about the kind of the taking the opposite stance there. I guess the question that I would have is that, does it assume that we have already kind of replaced or upgraded existing systems to electrify our buildings, and thus then
Mm.
the existing buildings, or rather the existing material, is what becomes then the next focus? Or we're suggesting that actually, even before we upgrade systems, it's actually the building materials themselves, like right now, that's actually the biggest culprit.
So the assumption is that you as an architect, the assumption in everything I discussed is you as an architect are designing a new building ground up, and there's not something already there. And
Got it.
so
Okay.
so smart money before was on, if you want to make it sustainable, make it more efficient. But since then, in the last 15 years, it's not talked about much, but we've done an amazing job in making our lighting way more efficient. Like it's a fraction. Our lighting is a fraction of what it was in terms of energy hog, right? And so, and then you say, okay, the building's going to be here for a long time, but the assumption is that it's not going to be burning fossil fuels to run it for most of that time. And so once you do that, then you say, okay, now what's the next lowest hanging fruit? Because, we need to be kind of smart. I mean, that's the ridiculous thing that no one's talking about is that yeah, we're looking at energy efficiency as a EUI, as basically per square foot. But if we keep building more square feet, if we double the amount of square feet that we're building every, I don't know, 15 years or whatever, if we double the amount of square feet in the world in 15 years, I don't know if that's the case, but let's say we did, but we only made it a quarter, and each one used 3/4 as much energy. So we shaved off a quarter of the energy. You could see how we're still behind. Like we're still producing more in absolute numbers. We're still producing way more carbon. And so architects get very uncomfortable talking about like the idea of not building, because that seems like, understandably, that's like, why would you go into
Right.
architecture to not build? So
Right.
there's that kind of embarrassing, like, let's not talk about it. Let's not talk about it. And also, when I first started teaching, if you put, in terms of sources of electricity, if you put coal in one hand and you put everything else in the other one, you put natural gas and oil and solar and wind and hydro and nuclear all in the other one. Uh, the first hand had more, was it was bigger than the others combined. There was more in the US. There was more electricity generation with coal than everything else combined. Now coal's like, I don't know, maybe 25% or something like that.
Yeah.
And renewables are, I don't know, they might be creeping up to something like 30%. And you're like, oh my gosh, it's amazing. Like at this rate, we'll be fine. But 30%, but we're using more total power, right? So back to the AI. So, we're using more total power to do things like run data centers. And so we're still using all the amounts, as far as I can tell. And it was like this for wood, when wood was our fuel source and we replaced it with, oil, and then we replaced oil with coal, and we replaced coal with renewables at each stage, natural gas with renewables at each stage. Yes, as a percentage, we started using basically all the new stuff is coal. All the new stuff is solar and wind, but the old stuff we're producing about as much as we used to, as far as I can tell. And so you can say, oh, our renewables were at 1%, when I started teaching, and now they're at 30% or 20%, whatever they're at, depending on where you live. But if that 20% is all the new power demand and all the old stuff is still our old system, I just don't know enough about enough about it to know that that's actually going to be helping us that as much as we
Yeah.
think.
This is the kind of math that does keep me up at night. In my particular case, I'm a bit biased towards kind of existing buildings because that's what
No,
keeps
sure,
us.
that's what you do.
But I just did back of the napkin math, and it kind of helped me maybe filter out what I might be missing here. But no one actually knows. But some of the best estimates put the existing built world at about 1.6 billion structures that are kind of broadly categorized into kind of t-shirt sizes of small, medium, large, extra large. There's also studies that I think you were suggesting where it's like also in the next 15 years, we are suggesting that to keep up with demand, we need to double our footprint. Just for a moment, I mean, I think we kind of lose like all sense of what all of this means in the numbers, but I asked myself if in fact it's true that we have 1.6 billion-ish buildings. Let's assume that we put pause on all new construction for the next 25 years from 2025 to 2050. Just back of the napkin math, 25 years, 1.6 billion divided by 25 years divided by 365 days. That's something like 160 something thousand buildings every single day that needs to be, well, in our case, we'd like to think that we're helping digitize, but to improve, but to literally improve that amount of buildings every single day from now to the next 25 years to really make a dent on this stuff, right? That also assumes that we put pause on all construction, which we obviously know is not true. Like when I just ask myself the enormity of like these numbers and then compare that to where just our industry is and what, like the conversations we're having about like, lead toilets and stuff. And like, sure,
Mhm.
we might be building like $1 billion skyscraper that passes these tests, but like literally what about the other
Mm,
99.9999% of
yeah.
buildings that, and I say this because we were patting ourselves on the back. So my company, we've digitized something upwards of about 6,000 buildings, which is, great for us. But what 0.000000000 like 1% of
Mhm.
of what's out there? Whatever. Even if we doubled that, it's like drop in the bucket. Like I what keeps me up is kind of both what the industry literally needs to look like in order for us to even have a fighting chance to upgrade the existing stock, let
Mm,
alone assuming, of course, that which we will have to continue expanding. And like what needs to be true from a design, from a construction, from a supply chain, from contractors, product manufacturers, if it were, in going back to kind of building systems, if the biggest culprits are things like the heating systems, windows, envelopes, like what literally needs to be true across all of
mm,
these government, design, construction, supply chains for us to even have a fighting chance? I still don't have a good answer other than
yeah.
I I I don't think we're making a dent unless
Yeah,
something drastic.
it does kind of feel like we're on a train that's heading like southbound towards a cliff, and we're going northbound from car to car, walking, high fiving each other that we're moving away from the cliff.
Right.
That kind of has that flavor to it. I mean, again, I just can share with you what I read. It seems like we're on a trajectory where we will be quicker than I think a lot of people thought. We will be making our electricity with renewables,
Yeah.
current administration notwithstanding, we'll be making our electricity with renewables sooner than we think. It always happens like this. It takes forever, and then
I know.
and then it's all at once. Like it's like what it always takes so long to start, and then it happens so quickly once it happens. Well, you
Yeah.
name the innovation, right? So there's that. I think if there's one thing, I've changed my tune a little bit since COVID. I think if for me, the takeaway from COVID is that we tried to change people's behavior and we had kind of mixed results, but then we had this innovation of a vaccine and we had really good results. And I now obviously we have to decarbonize our entire grid, but I'm now a believer in geoengineering. We're just going to have to cool the planet. I don't know, if that's going to be, sending particles up in the whatever sphere and
Yeah.
reflecting it. But I just, so I mean, I think that we have to. It was in the New York Times this week that the scientists now think that we've already passed the tipping point. There's not going to be coral reefs anymore. There'll be no more coral reefs, maybe forever. I don't know if they come back. I don't
Right.
know if I don't know if that the DNA comes. Whatever DNA makes coral reefs. If that's all gone, then maybe it never comes back, even if we fix the planet. And so we're going to
Right.
undergo, I assume, a whole bunch of these tipping points over the rest of my life. And I kind of wonder at what point do we say, "Well, we need to cool the planet?" Like, okay, yeah, we need to also, make more efficient power, and then we need to make more efficient, more green power, carbon-free power, and then we need to green the buildings and all that. But like, I don't know. As an environmentalist, I think we probably ought to start really embracing these, crazy ideas of putting umbrellas out there to stop the sun or whatever. We need to cool the damn planet. And so if I was, kind of going into I'm not an engineer, but if I was going into engineering, that would be the direction I go. And from what I understand, it's completely unproven, but God, there's going to be so many unintended side effects, just like every emergency, just like chemo has unintended, has bad side effects, but
Right,
it
right, right,
cures the
right.
cancer, right? So there's going to be Lord knows how many side effects when we do cool the planet, because I assume we're going to have to. But from what I understand, most of the estimates for the kind of the proposals that are out there that work on paper are like on the order of like $5 billion. I mean, they're really not that expensive, at the scale of a world. And so I assume that we're going to have to fix that. We're going to have to fix the actual temperature of the planet as we're decarbonizing our grid, moving to an electric transportation system and so forth. I don't know what we're going to do about airplanes, but a lot of I'm an environmentalist and I fly all the time. I know, if you look at the numbers, so one international flight is something like, I think, five tons of carbon round trip, and the average human on Earth puts 5 tons of carbon in the air and the atmosphere in a year.
Wow.
So one international flight that I took last month is equivalent to what the average human puts in a year across the Earth. And so, and I walk to work and I bike, I bike to work today, and I don't really drive, and I'm a freak about, I keep my windows open all the time. I freeze my family out in the winter. I boil them in the summer in my house. And, I do all the things that I think a good environmentalist should do. And then I take one flight and kind of ruin the whole thing. I think if a lot of us were really honest with kind of, with how we're living, it's very hard to change human nature.
I think on this note, Michael, you've no shortage of big thinking and big ideas here that you're leaving.
Thank you, Jose.
But I think one of the takeaways is we might have to cool the planet. We might have to
Yeah.
just if we've kind of crossed these tipping points, we all hands on deck. Michael, this has been really fun, man. As usual, I end these conversations, and I always think that we definitely need a part 2, 3 on any one of these subjects we've touched on today, from of course the climate to buildings themselves to the design of the buildings to the materials. I mean, you kind of give us an entire journey here. This has been really fun.
Thank you, Jose.